Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Mage, Errant, Book 7, The Last Echo of the Lord of Bells, Chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9. I'm trying to find the chapter title. Sorry, Kindle is different now. An unexpected rescuer, in the heart of the enemy, the demean of Petus the Younger, and story time. In these chapters, we find out the theory behind how Candaron is still alive, which is fascinating, and I still don't entirely understand it. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning this episode. Dan, as usual, is here in the chat. What's up, Dan? So, this section, you guys, I will be perfectly honest, and I'm jumping ahead here as I tend to do, but there comes a point where, the question is asked, how is Candaron still alive? She hasn't eaten or drunk anything in months. And I was genuinely surprised by the question. Because I just thought we could say magic. She's just alive due to magic. You know? That sort of acceptance of well, sure, I mean, it doesn't really make sense, but that's fine. And so to have somebody just straight up be like, well, how could that even work in such mundane terms with such practical questions, it really caught me off guard. So when it turned out there was a further explanation to why she was still alive, I was like, oh, I wasn't really looking for that. I was fine with it just being, because magic. But it is interesting. So, picking up where we left off. We had been in the midst of an attack by a bunch of mercenaries who were trying to take our friends down. And the whole, the culmination of this is a rescue that it turns out is thanks to Rhodes. Rhodes Karras of the royal family. Rhodes who fucking made poor Hugh's existence a nightmare for the first, 3 months of his stay at Stormhold? I don't even know exactly how long he was there. I don't remember. But, the whole thing is a bit of a mess. So Hugh is not concussed, but he is still in kind of a bad way. Even though he had no idea what was going on, he reached out and started pulling his crown nodes back to him. Partway through the process, the noises of battle grew especially loud, then cut off, and were replaced by a short, incomprehensible argument. And Sabe is looking at him and being like, "Are you okay, bud? I don't think he's concussed. I think it's a magical backlash." And he keeps saying weird stuff. She says we're about to go for a flight, and he thinks to himself, Mackerel's the only one who can fly. And I'm like, that's not true though, bud. You guys have I don't know if it's not considered true flight what Sabe does, but it's as good as, in my opinion. It's fine. When he'd put the last node back, he let all the spell forms in his mind's eye dissolve. I had weird dreams again tonight, Hugh said vaguely, thinking back to the night before for some reason. Sabe, are you sure he's not concussed? And when he says, where are we? How'd we get out of the ambush? They give him a sort of weird look, which understandably, you don't know how a person is going to react to this sort of thing in the best of times. And Hugh is even more unpredictable sometimes. And I mean, like, when I say unpredictable, that's not exactly fair, because actually is consistent. He is quite predictable, but I mean unpredictable in that most people, I think, would be genuinely surprised by the fact that he is willing to forgive and move on. So I think most people would consider his actions to be not something they would predict. That's really what I mean by that word. But it's not strictly speaking that he is unpredictable. And yeah, it turns out that Rhodes is here. And he is really this whole thing, you guys. So Rhodes, it turns out, is the Frost Ghost. And he says this, bless his heart, with the sincerity and self-satisfaction and excitement and pride of somebody who really expects them all to know what the fuck he's talking about. And they have never heard of him, and he is so deflated by this. And it really goes to show how much what Rhodes has done to Hugh has fallen by the wayside for me, because I felt for him in this moment and was just like, "Aw, guys, just pretend you know who he is." Like, I don't really want them to, but I just really, that sort of like disappointment when he was so excited to tell them, I understood how hard that would be. And he's like, "I have been doing this for months. I'm protecting the poor and weak. You really haven't heard of me? I've got bounties on my head from multiple nations and great powers after I've cracked down on their agents and smuggling rings. You'd have to be pretty far away not to have heard of me," Rhodes said. "We were off-world," Talia said, which Sabby and Godric both are sort of like, why are you telling him this? But he says, wow, just upstaging me again. And this whole, like, so there's a conversation later between oh my god, the great powers, the dragon and Sabé's grandma. Why am I blanking on both their names? But they're talking about how vigilantism they find frustrating and annoying, because there are so many things that you could do to change the world, and just like fighting crime isn't a worthy pursuit. And Hugh is sort of bemused by this, and then reflects that with the amount of power that those two have, sure, it must seem like a really petty concern. But if you aren't somebody with that kind of power, maybe this is like as much good as you can hope to do. Or if you're somebody that this person is protecting, then it matters quite a bit. And I really just like, this is such a nuanced and fraught topic. Like, the concept of vigilantism in some ways, of course, is like incredibly romantic and appealing, because you're working outside of anybody else's rules. You're delivering justice to people that otherwise would probably get away with things. You are saving people who are in trouble and don't have resources to fight back. And I fully believe all that's great. Then there's like the dark side of it, where, yeah, you're functioning outside of anybody's rules, so you could just do whatever the fuck you want. And if you are not a good person, or if you don't have good judgment, that's actually a bad thing. Or if you are somebody who decides that like XYZ is more damaging than ABC, you just exercise your judgment on that, whether or not that's like strictly speaking true or fair to the people involved. And this often gets brought up like regarding Batman, you know, the fact that he oftentimes is portrayed as like patrolling the streets and stopping people from like muggings and whatnot. And it's like, yeah, but you're also a billionaire and you could just give people money and maybe they wouldn't be robbing if they could afford health care. And I won't get into that whole argument, because big fans of Batman. There's a lot of like canon stuff that they'll throw in your face for that. So I'm not trying to, support that particular argument, but, it is the sort of thing where there are times when, because of oversimplifying what crime is, what it looks like, and where it comes from, we get into this like kind of weird space of acting as if, well, just being hard on crime is a good thing, when in fact, what qualifies as crime is a kind of complicated issue, and where crime comes from as well. So the idea that Rhodes has decided that he's going to be a vigilante, it really feels for me like somebody who's like overcompensating a lot because they feel deep shame about the fact that they fucked up so badly. And that's what I'm getting here, is like, despite the fact that he was being shamed in a way that like wasn't truly fair, Aiden Reminder, who was supposed to be his like mentor, Aiden did not tell Rhodes that he was being influenced by Bakori when he abandoned Hugh and his friends in the labyrinth. So for a long time, Rhodes had been living with the knowledge that he was a coward, and it was a total, like, Rhodes was a coward. That's what bullies are. But the actual circumstance in which this happened was not what it looked like. And despite finding out that it was not what it looked like, when somebody continuously shames you, there is a part of you that begins to believe it. It starts to sink in, even if you know it's not actually true, even if there's a smarter, more enlightened part of you. I think, everybody knows what I'm talking about, that there is something that you can still struggle with to this day regarding, a particular thing that somebody repeatedly was on your ass about. And you are aware that it's either wasn't true then, or it certainly isn't true anymore. And yet their voice is like in your head all the time. And you cannot help but instinctively hear them regarding this topic. So I am sort of reading this as Rhodes, feeling like he has to prove that he isn't a coward who abandons people, and that he wants to start to do the right thing. It's a really kind of fraught question whether or not this is the right thing for him to be doing in the big picture. He describes discovering some people who were being trafficked and saving them, which is just unquestionably a good thing. I don't care whose side that was doing that. That's evil. And yes, stop them. But the fact that this is him trying to, it seems almost prove something to an external force. It's like he's trying to prove something to Aiden, even though Aiden's dead. It doesn't matter anymore. That does not, whether somebody's dead or not, does not stop us trying to prove them wrong if they meant something to us. I can't help but wonder if his ego is too much in play, if that will influence the way he behaves. Because this is certainly an ego project. He's got a title for himself, and he's doing ice puns and stuff because he's the Frost Ghost, which is truly, I really wonder if he made that name up himself. I can't remember if it's mentioned. But coming up with a name for yourself as a superhero has got to be pretty tough. So I just kind of have my eye on him because Godric is remembering specifically later how Rhodes was really eager to have Godric on his own team and had the charm turn to 11. And then as soon as Godric decided to throw in with Hugh and his friends, there was just an absolute about face in Rhodes's behavior. And because of that, Godric isn't taking anything that Rhodes is doing here at face value at all. He is assuming he's turning on the charm because he needs us and wants to get credit for saving us and whatever. But as soon as what we are doing doesn't line up with what he wants us to be doing, he is going to turn into a complete bastard again. And I want so much for that to not be true. I want Rhodes to have grown, really grown, and I can't tell if he has or not. You know, I don't really know how much of... I don't know what else he has gone through since all of this. And I don't know how much he has really looked at his own behavior. This meet where he talks with him about what's going on. So he has like that confrontation with Aiden, which he explains here about, he confronted him about the lies with Bakori. And he says, the guy laughed at me and told me letting myself be manipulated made me even more pathetic. Which, wow, Aiden, you really were such a bastard. Like, he kept holding back in the early stages of our fight. I think he'd convinced himself that I really was as pathetic as he'd been saying. By the time he started taking me seriously, Headmaster Tarek and Candor on Crux showed up and I fled. I flew up here, but Aiden had been turning my family against me for a while, and his message reached them before me. His version of our fight was not very flattering to me. My family wasn't exactly welcoming. Only spent a few days with them before returning down to the city. And he says the whole vigilante thing was kind of an accident. I was broke, decided to rob an underground betting arena, turned out to be the base for a group of kidnappers who'd been ransoming children. The mask thing was just a disguise for the robbery. Things just kind of snowballed from there. And that's when Talia's like, oh my God, are you making ice puns? Which I am just really glad he didn't do Ice to See You, you know? But the whole thing with how this started, he was just trying to get money for himself because his family turned their back on him because of the way he had been portrayed to them by Aiden, who, granted, maybe Aiden was not telling the entire truth about Rhodes, but Rhodes' behavior to Hugh was so terrible that I can't be upset about this. You know, the kind of thing he was doing to Hugh, that in itself deserved for his family to turn their back on him. It was so shitty that even though it was for the wrong thing, I'm still like kind of in full support of them just deciding you're on your own, kiddo. And the fact that he like falls into this but because he was just going to rob somebody, it's not like, you know, he didn't stop and be like, no, I need to do the right thing because I have to make up for my past. It doesn't feel like it was a conscious decision. He was just trying to get by. He stumbled into a thing and maybe then began to realize there's like a tangible thing that I could be doing on the ground that actually is improving people's lives. And I'm sure saving kids, the kind of like thanks, gratefulness, adulation that he got for doing that fed into his ego as well. And I don't mean this as a strictly bad thing. We all do things a lot of the time that are good because it feels good for people to notice we've done something good. And even though I know that can feel like a really selfish motivation, I personally don't think there's anything wrong with feeling good about doing something good for somebody. There is just a fine line between like doing it and feeling good and only doing it for the credit, which is a completely different thing. I'm not trying to say he's even doing that, but it is interesting that he didn't go into that particular situation intending to like help anybody. He didn't know there was anything going on. He was confronted with something that he didn't know was happening and decided in the moment to take action. And I'm going to give him a little bit of credit on that because he could have taken the money and bailed and just been like, that's none of my business. There are a lot of people who would do that. And, you know, like, so I'm trying to give him credit, but also like be real about what exactly it is he's doing. Yeah. And MX Shard says, due process exists for a reason, and the cops already find the Punisher way too appealing. That is such a weird thing. Look, if anybody listening is a cop, first of all, don't be either listening or a cop. But the cops getting behind the Punisher is so hilarious, because the whole thing is that the Punisher hates the corrupt system. He doesn't like cops. He's not a cop. He wasn't ever a cop. He's not on their side. So the fact that cops, like, all it is them just being like, I should be able to do whatever the fuck I want. When the whole point of that comic was like, yet he would kill you for that. That's the point, is that if you abused your power, he would come after you, because that's a scummy thing to do. So weird how that got turned around, and now you see like Punisher symbols with the American flag and the thin blue line, like the most garbled message you can imagine. Anyway, Dan, yeah, unreliable narrator here. Maybe your family just realized you were an ass. Yes, that also occurred to me. Like, he's like, oh, he turned my family against me. I mean, maybe. I'm not even, like, it could just be that word of other things he had done got back to them. Who knows? So he says, this is really good. Sabe says, I can't for the life of me figure out what Aiden's motives were. Did he just enjoy being a jerk like you do? Ouch. I mean, I probably deserved that, but ouch. You definitely deserved that, Godric said. Rhodes shrugged and nodded. Aiden definitely enjoyed being cruel, but that's only part of the story. Pretty much everything he did was focused on one goal, being named one of Sarnassus' champions. He was certainly powerful enough for it. There were just all sorts of weird political complications. Far as I could tell, he was intending to somehow get my family on his side by convincing them that I'm worthless and then reforming me or something. And Sabe says, right, because pressure from foreign royalty won't irritate Sarnassus' powerful families and make them dig their heels in even more. Rhodes shrugged. I never claimed my former master was actually good at politics. He was more than powerful enough to be appointed a champion, but he kept ruining his own chances with his schemes and stunts. And that's a really weird thing. I'm like, wondering if there's more to that story. I don't need there to be. This is not a line of inquiry I'm all that interested in. But I do just like the idea that Aiden was such a legend that when the book started and Hugh is thinking about who could be his mentor, it's like Aiden is the absolute pinnacle of what you are looking for. And how predictable it felt to him that Rhodes got chosen. And then to find out after the fact that it likely was about a whole lot more than just the fact that Rhodes had, 3 affinities, I think, at the time. Just how much more was going on there. And Hugh was just looking at it as, he's the best, I want him to want me. And what a fucking bullet he dodged. Dan says, unless you are a cop in a Scandinavian country, in which case keep up the good work. I don't know anything about that, so I'm not going to comment on it. Meanwhile, off to the side, Hugh is just sort of puzzling over how he feels regarding Rhodes, and he really, he doesn't want revenge. He still realizes that that's a fucking pointless exercise. And he is still trying to understand, like, Rhodes and what it is that he really wants and whether this sort of, like, selfless action is sincere. And it says the noble was unquestionably powerful beyond any single member of their group. Not by much, though. Despite Rhodes rescuing them, he'd sprung his own ambush on their ambushers with fresh mana reservoirs. Still well into Archmage territory, though, and on his way toward becoming at least a lesser great power someday. Rhodes also seemed to be at something of an impasse in regard to his loyalties and where he belonged at the moment. Hugh hated the idea of taking advantage of that, but... And then he interrupts. Rhodes looked almost nervous to Hugh, though he wasn't quite certain of that. "You haven't asked us any questions yet, not even about being off-world," Hugh said. "Why is that?" Rhodes, oddly, looked much more confident at that question. "Oh, easy. I do have plenty of questions, like what's going on with your eyes, but I figure I have more reason to trust you lot, or at least trust what your feelings are toward me than you do for me. Letting you take charge and ask questions makes you more comfortable, more willing to reciprocate when I eventually ask questions. Pretty standard diplomatic training for my family." And yeah, there's just a real sense here of like, Rhodes is clearly thinking that Hugh is going to be like, "So, are you going to fucking apologize or like even acknowledge what you did to me or anything?" And there's, good reason to wonder that. I think a lot of other people in Hugh's position would. And so when Hugh doesn't do that, he's like unexpectedly frank. I'm not sure if it's a direct result of Hugh asking him something that is much easier to answer than what he thought he was going to be facing, but I kind of put it down to that a little bit. So Hugh says, "I'd like to extend an invitation for the Coven's upcoming diplomatic summit." And Rhodes is like, "Well, considering the tension with my family, I don't think that's a good idea." And Hugh's like, No. I am not inviting Rhodes Carex. I am inviting the Frost Ghost." And everybody's like, "Oh shit." And yeah, this is an interesting idea. Like, especially, you talk about the group in terms of what you would put together if you were organizing a D&D campaign. And they don't really have a rogue on their team. So if they could get somebody like him, we need some sneaky intelligence gathering type that are loyal to like Hugh and his friends specifically, in a way that I don't know they've got anyone. All of the information that they have gathered has been through either like Sabe's grandmother or like word on the ground, I think. And who knows what's been left out. So that's just my like personal immediate approval of this, but it's not necessarily in line with what they are ultimately looking to do, because I'm not sure what they are. So we go to chapter 7. And this is an interesting thing. So Valia, she is reversing her stance on something. And, there's a lot of talk here about how the Havathi are growing more and more mistrustful of her because of how many times Alustin and her have had like close encounters and he has gotten away. There has been a lot of thought that maybe they're in on something together. And later on, when it turns out that some information was leaked, it again turns out that people are accusing her of being the leak. And it's funny because when we're in her head, it's like, I can understand why everybody thinks that, but we know just how steadfast she is. She is nothing if not stubborn, honestly, in a lot of ways. So she goes up and Icola says, "Speak your proposal. In light of the threat posed by Alustin, I propose 2 responses: doubling the resources used for the evacuation, and second, to begin pulling troops away from our outer territories, save those in the south fighting off Sika's troops to protect the capital." And she's just like watching everybody erupt into chaos, even though they knew what she was going to fucking say when she came up here. She ended with a summation of what little intelligence and speculation Havath had regarding the super weapons Alustin had stole from Skyhold's vault. It wasn't a heartbeat before the first heckler called out, "None of which he'd have if you'd killed him years ago." Valia gave the older noble a flat look and nodded. "That's correct." The noble spluttered angrily, but couldn't muster any clever reply to direct agreement. This is what I like to call pulling an 8 Mile. Those of you who have seen that movie, they get into a rap battle, and what he does is he disarms his opponent by getting up there and just talking shit about himself and basically cutting off every line of attack that the guy was going to use against him by doing it first. And honestly, I am a big fan of this approach because nobody ever expects you to cop to your mistakes. They just don't. And, you know, like, I understand that. If she were in a bigger position of power, I'm not even sure I would endorse this the same way because, you know, there's different tactics for different positions. But for where she's at now, I just loved the fact that she only says, yeah, so, well, what are you going to do? There were a few objections about focusing so much on the lesson, but they were quashed. Military strategy was ultimately under the control of the Duarcs, and they tended to be incredibly jealous of those prerogatives. Icola was no exception, and if anything, had grown even more territorial after the Conclave had forced through Project Vengeful Sword over her objections. And we find out later on that Project Vengeful Sword was a series of incredibly powerful, dangerous magical objects that were left in various cities to be released or to be set off if they didn't cooperate with Havath. And it was supposed to be kind of a fail-safe thing, except that a lot of these things were discovered and it just wedged an even bigger, like, obstacle between the cities that already were kind of iffy on cooperation and Havath. Like, once people found this stuff that they had been planning to do, one of them was like a fire elemental that they wound up having to take out into the ocean and drown, which sounds kind of horrible, to be honest. But they all are just like, oh, wow, you were going to do what? Yeah, we are not interested in being partnered with people like that. Thanks, no thanks. We're going to pass. And that is a leak. That's the leak that is rumored to be down to Valia. But, yeah, this whole thing is so, like, fucking believable. An even more frequent objection was the cost, to which Valia repeatedly asked what the cost of a Havathi life was and what their budget for preserving them was. The most common objection of all, of course, was to Valia herself. And the Duarc says, all right, let's just vote. And they actually vote to agree to the... Oh my God, you guys, what is with words lately? They are slipping out of evacuation. Christ almighty. I was about to say evangelical. I had so many wrong fucking words circling around. Goddamn. Now, you know, the fact that they're trying to evacuate as many people as they are. Look, there's a whole thing, and I won't get into this again because I kind of got into it in the last episode, but there was recently a demand that Gaza be completely evacuated before it was bombed. 1 million people live there, and they were like, you've got 24 hours to all leave, which is fucking insane. It is absolutely unreasonable, and we're still like... So anyway, these fictional people in this fictional place are the fictional bad guys. And they're still, like, doing a better, more, like... Anyway, it's just... So, to Valia's mild surprise and extensive relief, the representatives of several provinces and cities immediately offered to take in large quantities of refugees. Several of those cities were Lich domains, and she suspected the Liches would be doing their best to encourage the refugees to stay. And this is because Liches need everybody to come to them, and they, you know, it gets... I would assume pretty lonely in the stability of like a place. You need to be able to have like an ongoing population in order to have art and entertainment and everything. So yeah, they're kind of like big on getting people like incentives to come and stay. So then she goes to her room and she finds one of the intertwined, one of the liches that's like, you know, part of that cooperative group in her office. And they use apparently a kind of like golem avatar to communicate when they don't want to reveal exactly which one of them it is that she's talking to. So she comes in and they do the like, you know, we have heard that you're the leak. We have heard that you're not super loyal. She doesn't really, I don't know if this is exactly bait, but she just doesn't really like give that much of a, like, she doesn't give it the time of day, I suppose is the way I want to say this. And immediately moves on with like, I feel like I have been really clear. My record speaks for itself. I don't know what else to tell you. The only good part of Vengeful Sword was how many of the threatened cities had destroyed the deployed weapons rather than keeping them. And she's sort of like, although I'm sure that there are a couple places that claimed that they destroyed theirs and didn't, because they are pretty fucking valuable. And, you know, some place might not have a lot of things of that level up their sleeve. And this is pretty difficult in terms of like relative power. Apparently these objects can be more valuable than a great power because they're that much harder to replicate and duplicate. We heard mutterings. Some suspect you of being the leak, yada, yada, yada. We're also absolutely certain there was a leak. It was Duark Icola. And it says, bold of you, she says, bold of you to put so much in the Conclave's wards. Who knows how many seers could be listening to us now? The anti-scrying defenses of the Conclave remain intact. We would know if they'd failed. More, we have tested your own wards extensively. No one listens to us. And if your evidence regarding Icola turns out to be convincing, the repeated disasters of the past couple of decades, have been overwhelmingly the failures of the Duarks. The Dominion instituted the Duark system to avoid the failure of single ruler systems, but the fundamental short-sightedness of the Duarks is leading us down those exact same paths of failure. We need more far-sighted leaders. And she's like, so I'm known to be extremely loyal to her. Why are you coming to me with this? If we were to move solely with enemies of Icola at our backs, it would cast doubt on the legitimacy of our actions, make us seem as though lust for power were our only motive. If we have an Icola loyalist like you on our side, it changes everything. Your loyalty to Havath far outweighs your loyalty to Icola. And your loyalty to Havath is not merely loyalty to its survival or power, but loyalty to its principles and its laws. When you opposed Vengeful Sword, Icola's betrayal of the project is a betrayal of Havath itself. She circumvented the Dominion's legal structures, its checks and balances against corruption. And she's like, okay, say I agree with all of that. Why would I support a change instead of like just getting somebody else to replace Icola? Because the power of the Duarks is far too much to be concentrated in the hands of a mere two people. And Valia's like, so let me guess. You want there to be 7 people, right? Oh, wow. Couldn't have seen that one coming. And the Lich just smiles faintly, but doesn't answer. And before it leaves, it says to her, there are games being played that you have no concept of. And there are powers that Icola owes. And they basically consider themselves the owners of Havath. So just keep that kind of shit in mind. And when it leaves, she's just sort of frustrated because that's like very close to what Alustin also told her. And she does not like anybody agreeing with him, because this is a big accusation and it's so friggin' vague. You know, what do you even do with it? So then we go to chapter 8. And this is the bit where we are in Godric's head and he is thinking about how little he trusts Rhodes, even though, like, you know, he hasn't had the kinds of experiences and run-ins with Rhodes that the others have, which makes sense because Godric was never somebody who was like without power at the school. He always had a good grasp of what his attunements were. He had his father who was like fucking famous and at the school. Of course he would not have had those kinds of experiences. And I love that there's like a lair that they're taken to, but it's not like his real lair. And I can't remember what it is that he wants them to call it. I think it's, oh yeah, the Icy Tomb. Oh my God. That's so goofy. When Godric caught Sabe muttering about the annoyance of being upstaged by Rhodes, he did his best to console her by pointing out that they hadn't actually been trained in subterfuge outside of some cryptography classes. And again, pretty excited that maybe we've got a rogue entering the scene here. So he's showing them the way that they're going to have to go. It's a bit of a climb. I love that everybody starts to like give him a hard time, and finally he catches on that they're all kind of fucking with him. And it's sort of like sweet in a way because it feels like, oh, they're making him part of the team. But I don't think that any of them really are. I think that everyone is struggling to be cool with Rhodes for Hugh's sake. I know that for me, this is something that I will run across with friends who have like partners that I don't like, that I know have mistreated them, and I just have to try and be cool with that person. But despite the fact that I am aware of what they're doing, I have to just turn that part of my brain off in order to get along. And I wonder if they were like sort of let off the leash for a second, what they would do if he was like, no, I do want revenge. You know what I mean? But anyway, they reached the domain of Pitos the Younger early the next day. And this place is interesting. It's made entirely of bismuth. And I finally went and looked this up because I did not know what on earth he was talking about. It was a maddening sprawl of bizarrely stacked metal right angles, shining with rainbow iridescence. And if you guys have not looked up bismuth because of this description, I urge you to do it. Strangest fucking thing you've ever seen. It does not look like it's naturally occurring. When he talks about the right angles, I mean, it basically looks like a series of squares stacked up in very odd, almost random seeming patterns. It doesn't look like the kind of thing that happens naturally. It looks like there was a pile of square chains links, like the links of a chain that got stacked up and left, and there was a fire, and they got sort of like melted together. And that's what it looks like. And it has an iridescent sheen of the type that, like, this is the kind of thing that I have several eyeshadows that mimic this look. So it was interesting to me to see like that. And it's even mentioned here, it didn't take on that rainbow hue until it was processed. And I did see some pictures of what it looks like when it hasn't been processed. And it is like much more dull, but it does still have that square thing going on. So yeah, sounds really, really wild. P.S. the Younger had a long history of hosting diplomatic meetings between various nations and powers, and despite his relative lack of power compared to many liches, it was fairly safe from attack. Sorry. MX Shard says like inverted step pyramids. I like that comparison. Forgive me, guys. I'm getting out my back scratcher because I suddenly have like an absolutely horrible itch on my back that I can't reach. That's why I keep this here, though. The kind of rainbow shimmer, almost like a more colorful oil slick. Yeah, oil slick is a very good way to describe it. Dan says there are so many cool ass rocks. This is also like when I went and looked up bismuth. I didn't look up what the properties of it are, but it was being sold as like a crystal for healing, you know, like metaphysical type stuff. And I should have looked up what exactly the properties were supposed to be, because depending on, you know, a variety of factors, things can be used for, you know, romance, or for clarity of mind, or for physical healing of ailments, things like that, according to certain traditions. And I really wonder what the one for bismuth is. MX Shard says, I love how Bierce's love of geology shows in these books. Yeah, there was a comment left a while back on a YouTube video where somebody was like, I feel like Bierce just has a minor in geology or something and wanted to show off sometimes. Something like that. And I was like, that makes sense. This is, you know, it's at least a pretty major part of the story a lot of the time. But it is something that, for the most part, I have no interest in. The bismuth is cool, but that's about it for me. So this is when they run up on Ilinia, finally. And I do appreciate the mention that Rana knew they were there before the others because of her scent affinity, and Godric realizing, like, oh yeah, we have a scrying block with Mackerel. But if somebody has scent magic, then that's not going to matter. So it's a good reminder that we got to take in all 5 senses to account if we're going to try and be stealthy. Dan, can't hide your stank ass. That feels very personal, Dan. So, to Hugh's mild disappointment, Ilinia didn't fly them to a meeting point somewhere inside of Peta's demesne, but rather over to a nearby mountaintop that had been flattened and covered in anti-scrying wards. Hugh was genuinely impressed at their quality. They were done in an elegant, incredibly mana-efficient style. Whoever had designed them was well used to creating wards in areas of low ether density like this. It was a little better than High Vale, but the mana was still uncomfortably sparse. And I don't know why, but it always gives me a sense of, like, calm when we come across a ward that Hugh is like, oh, this is good. Because I don't, like, I know that Hugh is advanced, unusual. He's gifted with wards. So most of the time, him being better than whatever he runs across is fine. But I do need to be reassured every now and then that he's not the best. That there are still people out there that are very, very good. So they are left, like, they leave almost everybody back there except for Ilinia, Indris, and Talia's elder brother, Luthi. Hugh was, he admitted, relieved to get away from the crowd. Meeting new members of Talia's family tended to be a bit overwhelming. So it turns out here that Talia's father left the ruling of things to Luthi for now, the title of war leader. They've been working to convince the elders to vote on it since we left to help with the siege, and the news of our victory just sealed the deal. Now our parents are refusing to participate in any decision-making processes and just being ridiculously supportive of everything I do. I love the idea of these parents just going, great idea. Absolutely. Let's do that. To literally anything. Like, you say it, they support it. And then you say, well, maybe we should do the exact opposite of that. And they're like, best idea you've had all day. Excellent. Wow. You are really made for this job. Like, you would just never know what's right and not. I find that very funny. So Ilinia is like, all right, where the fuck have you been? What's happened to your eyes? And why did you bring a goddamn vigilante? And they explain about Rhodes' Cherax, which Cherax. You guys, I never thought they were going to just tell Ilinia who he was. I really thought they were going to keep him on the DL. And I don't know why, because I'm not really sure there's a way to keep that sort of secret from her. Like, I don't know what all of her capabilities are. And because I'm not entirely sure what the plan is for putting him to work, it makes sense that I don't really know how they're going to handle things. But yeah, this is when Indris says, vigilantes irk me. They're profoundly boring. Imagine having the power to reshape the very world around you and wasting it on some simple crime fighting. And Hugh just being like, yeah, well, you guys are powerful, so you don't like when people stand up to you, probably, you know, because I would have to assume that some of the shit he has interfered with was stuff that great powers were involved with. He did, however, still somewhat agree about vigilantes being boring. There were so many more imaginative uses for magic. He'd rather spend his time designing wards than fighting crime any day of the year. And this is the sort of thing that I am like, I feel like you could do both, first of all. But also, as somebody who is very low on the totem pole, actually, that's like probably not a great thing to be saying anymore. Anybody who is at the bottom rung on the ladder of class, I'm going to have a lot more concern about simple things like crime and protecting people. And if I got magic, would absolutely be doing that sort of thing. Not necessarily like fighting, like physical fighting, but like a thing that I bring up a lot was this plot line in The Magicians, the TV show, which was, for me, one of those things that was so close to being really great and just never quite got out of its own way. And there were a lot of plot lines that would get brought up that seemed promising and then got kind of dropped before anything was really done with them. And there was a character, very briefly, who found out that she had power, and it was essentially in the fictional universe, it was like she lived in Flint, Michigan, and she used her power to fix the pipes, to just take all of the lead out of the drinking water. She found like a way to do that. And I wanted so much for that to be pursued, for there to be a series of storylines of people who just want to take natural disasters or like things that had gone wrong due to human error or whatever and just fix them in a way that otherwise would have taken millions of dollars or billions of dollars, and just completely make it so that there doesn't have to be a vote on it. There doesn't have to be years of work. We are just going to do it because we shouldn't have to be worrying about our kids drinking lead water in the fucking year 2023. Which, by the way, pretty sure Flint still has lead water. But they didn't really pursue that, and that character sort of like just decided to do a different thing and vanished. And I was so bummed, because that's the sort of thing that preoccupies my mind all the time, are how many things that are ruining people's lives, but they don't have to be that way. We could just make them not be that way. And there's so much red tape or paperwork or objection from, private interests that these like innocents are made to suffer. So I just sort of, I don't know. I don't fully agree with it being boring. Like, if you can make it so that somebody's life isn't ruined with a couple of small actions, I don't know why you wouldn't want to do that. Anyway, so they explain about the labyrinth and everything. And, this whole thing with like being off world, there's a moment where Ilinia brings up like strange diseases and stuff, which it would make sense that she is really sensitive to that due to her experience with this plague. So she's like, you guys could have done so much damage. And instead, Indris like chimes in here. And she's like, first of all, us in Kemetrius, we got a lot of people going back and forth, which means that that's just not going to be likely. And secondly, the places that they spent time in otherwise, they were there for months and they did not contract anything. That's enough time to be pretty certain it's safe and fine. But Elinia is just kind of like, there's a sense for me, she's mad at the fact that they like got one over on her more than she's mad at what they've been doing. And she just wants to yell at them, which I can understand, and when she tries to say like, well, you don't know anything about an off-world, it's an interesting moment here because Indra says, well, I have for a little bit, actually. When I was younger, I was a bit of a Hellion. And she says, I had the luck of being rescued and returned to our world by a rather unusual traveler. And Hugh says, did your mysterious traveler have unreadable words moving across their skin? And Indris is like, no, he didn't. But I'm indebted to him, and I'm not going to tell you any more about him. So what exactly was the deal with going off-world? And they mentioned trying to save Kandaron. And once it becomes clear that there's been a pact, Elinia starts to be like, what fuckhead did you pact with? And she realizes like, oh God, you didn't. And Hugh says, yeah. And also we saved Kandaron. He was deeply grateful to have his friends there to cover the various questions like, are you all insane? And did you shipwreck your brain? Elinia was especially aghast at the thought they'd risked passing each other their various magic issues through their pact. It had taken quite some time for Hugh to convince her he'd known what he was doing there. It was genuinely frustrating for Hugh. It wasn't that he didn't enjoy discussing Etherbody functions or Warlock Pact principles and spellform designs. He'd happily talk about them for hours. No, it was the fact that Elinia's whole line of questioning seemed to cast doubt on Hugh's competence, which... Yep, I have been on the receiving end of this sort of thing. And every question this person asks makes you be like, the fact that you're even asking me this is so insulting. And I know you don't mean it that way, but I swear to God, I'm not a fucking, like, irresponsible asshole. I will check on things. And especially somebody like me who does so much research before taking action in certain ways. I will just want to say to people, you clearly don't know me very well. Do you think that like that wasn't one of the first questions I asked is whether or not XYZ would work? And it just really, I think it's because I tend to be so thorough and I am more competent than most people I have met. Being questioned that way makes me extra fucking cranky. Because I am just disgusted on the daily with the like people I run into and how much they don't give a shit or how little thought they put into things, that when somebody slows me down by just getting basic shit in my face and being like, did you think of that? Fuck off. Yes, I did actually. So Hugh says that he can feel her dreaming. And this is when Elinia says, how could she still be alive? And they mention, he says, you know how she's bigger than normal? Less small, you mean? Indris interjected an amused tone in her voice. Literally everyone rolled their eyes at the Dragon Queen, which I did think was funny. Some of her injuries at the top of Skyhold went deep. I could see her bones. They were made of ether crystal. I think Kandaron has turned herself into some sort of partial lich. I think the only way for her to survive is to fully transition into lichdom. So is that like the ring that was tunneled under is that her lich territory? Demine? Indra says she's not nearly large enough to contain a demine. I'm not nearly large enough. Her wings. She stores most of her mass in extraplanar spaces. Do any of us really have any idea how large her ether crystal really is? I think you might have something there, Alinea said. If anyone could do it, it's her. There's not a being on the continent that knows more about creating liches than her. But that doesn't do us any good. She's going to lose at least her stellar affinity. It's possible she might keep her planar, but odds are she'll just end up a crystal lich. And that's if she's even solved the problem of becoming a mobile lich, Indra said. If she keeps her extraplanar spaces, that solves part of the problem, but being actually capable of moving the bulk of a demesne is only one of many technical issues. And Talia is like, oh, no worries then, because this means that since you guys don't think that she can do it, she will definitely be able to do it, and she's going to show up at the 11th hour, and she's just going to solve all our problems. And Hugh is like, look, I know that's what you think. Normally this is very adorable, but this is not a joke. Like, they're correct about a lot of the difficulties that she's going to face here. We need to keep this hidden. Right now, no one with serious power is particularly interested in the orb that she left atop Skyhold. If we let this leak, that will change in a hurry. And Indris and Alinea look at each other, and Hugh gets a little tense, and Alinea says, is there anything we can do to help? And Hugh relaxes for a sec. And then Alinea sees that and is like, oh, wow, you really thought I was going to stab her in the back. Look, dude, I'm not trying to say that we're BFFs, but our interests overlap. And I always do what's right for the long-term planning for my family. So don't forget it. And as much as like, I appreciate what she's saying, I don't think that he doesn't know that. I think that he is smart enough to realize that your interests may not be entirely known to him. You know, we like to think we know where you stand, but we may not be fully correct about that, and who knows what you could do. I just think that this is her being like, it's like you don't know me at all. And I'm like, no. More like, well, maybe he does kind of know you, and that you keep secrets and just, you know, do things that are sort of fucking shady. So personally, I'm not blaming him one bit, and I think she protests a little bit too much. That's all. As much as I enjoy Alinea in her way, I do not trust her one single little bit. So then this is when Alinea brings up to Sabe that she lied about the plague, and Sabe is like, yep, sure did. We were told not to tell you. And I love when Alinea says, you preyed on my fears. And Sabe's like, yes. And Alinea just like, all right, well, she knows better than anybody. Yeah, that's a valid way to handle the thing. And she says, why would you keep it from me? Because Kandaron let us know that if word of what had been stolen got out, monsters far more dangerous than she was would rip apart this continent to get their hands on it. The weapon Alustin stole isn't from this world, and it terrified her worse than the exile splinter. Ilinea's only response to that was pulling out her flask, uncorking it, and taking a long drink. And that's the end of chapter 9. So, yeah, I am really, I don't know, kiddos. I do not know where we're headed exactly. I don't trust a lot of people in this story, too. So it's the sort of thing where if they just do what they say they're going to do, that's going to be just as surprising as anything. Yeah. So, but these were good chapters. I was very, very engaged in these. And really still curious about Rhodes. Got my eye on him. We'll see. All right. Well, thank you all again so much for hanging out and for listening. Hope you're enjoying the coverage. Thank you, Dan, for commissioning it. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
Unspoiled Network podcast.